My name is Ranger Rebecca, and like Kaylee said, I work at James A. Garfield National Historic Site, just right down the road from the library. But today I'm coming from you from Chardon, Ohio. So I'm here today to talk about Battle of Mill Springs. So Battle of Mill Springs, this is one of the national park's newest national historic sites. It became a national historic site September of last year. And this is one of the battles that I really didn't know anything about before today. So I had fun learning about the Civil War battlefield that happened in Kentucky, one of many that happened in Kentucky. The battles of Mill Springs took place January 18th and 19th of 1862, mainly January 19th, but there was some that leading up to the actual day that it happened. It is said to be the first major Union victory of the war thus far. What's in a name? When learning about the Civil War, there are normally two different names that are given to a battle. Southern troops normally chose nearby towns, while Northern troops picked streams or rivers. An example would be Antietam Creek, or Sharpsburg. Another example, Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. But going through this battle, I found that there were 9 different names that could possibly be called. And so this is a list of those names. And you can see Fishing Creek was about 4 miles away, so that was a good possibility. Logan's Crossroads, that's another good one. Somerset, Webb's Crossroads was 10 miles away, so that really had no ranking. The city of Nancy, where the Battle of Middle Creek is today, did not exist, but it would have existed today. Cliff or Clifty Creek, Old Fields, Cumberland, and then finally we see Mill Springs. And it was Mill Springs that General Thomas, in his report after the battle, he wrote, "Across from camp at Mill Springs." So that's how the Battle of Mill Springs emerged. Okay, let's discuss the Commonwealth of Kentucky's involvement during the war. The 2 national leaders were born in Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln was born in Hodgenville, and President Davis of Confederate States was born in Fairview, which about 2 hours apart from each other, if you look at the map. While many other states were divided amongst themselves over the issue of slavery, the Commonwealth decided to remain neutral at the beginning of the war. That would change when fighting entered onto bluegrass soil. From the bombardment of Fort Sumter in April of 1861 up until the Battle of Mill Springs in January of 1862, Kentucky saw 5 different engagements. The first occurred September 19th, 1861. As we know, 20 years later, in September 19th, 1881, President Garfield passes away. So that's kind of a Garfield connection there. And that took place at the Battle of Barberville. The second battle occurred October 21st, 1861, at the Battle of Camp Wildcat. Battle of Ivy Mountain was November 8th and 9th of 1861. Rowlett's Station was December 17th, 1861, and probably the most famous one to occur in Kentucky thus far took place January 10th, 1862. So in today's, about three days ago today, this year, 2021, and that was the Battle of Middle Creek. And we, maybe some of you will know that Colonel James A. Garfield played a major role during that battle. But we're not here today to talk about James Garfield during the Civil War. We're here to talk about Kentucky in the Civil War. So that's what we're going to do. Who were the leaders during the Battle of Mill Springs? I'm going to give you a quick overview of 3 of the major ones here. The first on the left is George H. Thomas. He was a Southern-born gentleman who decided to stay with his country instead of his home state of Virginia, like so many of his other soldiers in the Civil War did. He rose to the ranks and was stationed in Kentucky, which was considered the Western Theater during the war. It's kind of funny to think about Kentucky being in the Western Theater. The Confederate troops during the Battle of Mill Springs were under the leadership of George B. Crittenden. Crittenden was born in Kentucky in 1812. At the beginning of the war, he chose to stay with his native Kentucky and accepted a commission as colonel in the Confederate States Army. He was promoted to brigadier general August 15th in 1861 and briefly commanded a brigade before receiving another promotion in November and was assigned to the District of East Tennessee. His brother Thomas was a Union general. So when they truly say it was brother against brother, family against family, it was. And then on the right, the farthest right, we see Felix K. Zollicoffer. He was born May 19, 1812 in Tennessee. He volunteered for the U.S. Army in 1836, became an active in the Tennessee Whig politics, first in the state Senate and then later as a U.S. representative for 3 terms. He was a strong supporter of states' rights, but opposed to Tennessee's secession. He served on the Peace Commission to Washington in late 1860. When the war began, Zollicoffer was commissioned a colonel in the Confederate States Army in July of 1861, and he commanded troops in eastern Tennessee and southeastern Kentucky, defending the Cumberland Gap. As we just discussed earlier, both North and South recognized the importance of holding Kentucky. Both sides moved troops into the state in the late summer and fall of 1861. The western part of the Confederate defensive line was anchored on the Mississippi River at Columbus, the yellow arrow. And in the south at Bowling Green, where a large force was gathering, Brigadier General Felix Zollicoffer, whom we discuss further in this presentation, brought Confederate troops from Tennessee into Kentucky at Camp Wildcat in 1861 that I mentioned earlier, right there. But he was repulsed after bringing them into Camp Wildcat. He decided to return to Kentucky from a different direction and reach the south bank of the Cumberland River near Mill Springs in November of 1861, where he set up his winter camp. After being in this location for about a month, he decided to move to the northern bank instead and move to Beech Grove, Kentucky, where winter camp was again established. It was in January 1862 when Major General Crittenden arrived to take over command of Zollicoffer's troops. In all, there were about 6,500 Confederate troops in the area. On the other side, the Union side, it was believed Crittenden would attack and overwhelm Confederates, so troops were marched into the area near Fishing Creek. Inclement weather delayed General Thomas from making much movement against rebel forces. Thomas's forces camped at Logan's Crossroads, a key intersection 9 miles west of Somerset and about 9 miles north of Zollicoffer's camp at Beech Grove on January 17, 1862. Again, there was no clear communication, and the Confederates thought that heavy rain would make Fishing Creek impassable, keeping more reinforcements from joining Thomas at Logan's Crossroads. This was not true, and 3 infantry regiments and an artillery battery were sent to Thomas's support, giving the Federals a force of about 4,500 men. Crittenden ordered an advance of the Confederate Army at midnight on January 18, 1862. The stage was set for the Battle of Mill Springs. This portrait right here shows General Schroff's troops coming to Fishing Creek to reinforce General George Thomas and his men. And General Schroff, he was part of the 9th Ohio. They were from Cincinnati area, and they were an all-German regiment. And I'm not sure, but many of you might know the Fighting McCooks, the McCook family that was in Ohio. One of their sons was with that regiment. And on the next few slides, I am going to be using the same map from the American Battlefield Trust, but different arrows to show different troop movements. The yellow arrows that you're going to see will be for the Confederates, and the blue arrows will be for the Union side. The Union troops, which had been reinforced the evening of the 18th, were located near Logan's Crossing, located at the top of this map. You can see it's right next to where it says Mill Springs to the right. The Confederates did not know this had already happened, so they didn't know that the Union had approached. So they arrived on the morning of the 19th thinking to ambush Union troops. They wanted to ambush the troops. At 6:30 a.m. on the 19th, Confederate cavalry from the 4th and 5th Kentucky met the Union forces of the 10th Indiana and 1st Kentucky Cavalry. So Kentucky had Union troops and Confederate troops. Here's the 10th Indiana, the 4th Kentucky. These Union troops were able to resist the advance of the enemy, who were spread far apart, and as Confederates reached the high grounds, the 10th Indiana was reinforced with the rest of their troops. Confederates, yellow arrow, Crittenden led Zollicoffer's men from the 20th Tennessee, 19th Tennessee, and the 25th Tennessee, while the 15th Mississippi was advancing toward the front battle line. This advancement of Mississippi troops was enough to send the Union troops back down the hill towards the woods. Please keep in mind, while this is happening, it is taking place early dawn with rainy weather, and because these conditions, the roads are full of mud. So you can imagine the fighting conditions are not good right now. The fighting continued for about an hour before the 10th and the 1st Kentucky Cavalry start running out of ammunition. Those troops had to fall back to the fence line and were finally reinforced by the 4th Kentucky. As the 4th came in, the 10th and the 1st were able to regroup with themselves and join again as a whole with the new troops from Kentucky. The 10th Indiana, 1st Kentucky, and now the 4th Kentucky all joined to fight against the 15th Mississippi, which is the arrow there, you see the yellow arrow, as well as other Confederate troops. This larger force was too much for Mississippi, and they all began moving to the right, which is now with the arrow. From the wooded area, the Mississippians could attack the Union line from a distance rather than needing to be right on top of the enemy. The picture on the left is of Union Colonel Speed S. Fry from the 4th Kentucky. He didn't like this approach. He didn't like them coming from the woods. He wanted them to face them head on, and so he was furious. He didn't want them to do this, so he stood on top of that fence and he waved his swords in front of them. Why would he do something like this? He thought the opposition were being cowards. for not fighting face to face and eventually egged them on. And they obliged him. With Fry basically telling the Confederates to attack, that's what they did. By this time, Confederate troops, mainly the 15th Mississippi, is located at the ridgeline on the western side of the road. Since this battle takes place at the beginning of the second year of the war, 1862, most of the men fighting are still newbies. They still haven't fought very much. So you have to think of that. They're new to fighting. They add conditions to the road, the weather. It is late morning, but now it is still dark and rainy. Add to that more gunfire, and then being in a dense wooded area. You think something bad's going to happen? Maybe. Needless to say, visibility was very poor. What could be worse? And what could possibly happen? Among the confusion that was taking place, Confederate General Felix K. Zollicoffer, that you see on the screen here, led his Confederate troops, which included the 19th and 25th Tennessee, these two arrows here, towards the Union line. So he, as the Confederates were moving, at the same time, Colonel Fry, that we just saw, with his 4th Kentucky, was moving to his right, which is our left, and was going to attack the Confederate front line, just as Zollicoffer wanted to do. Zollicoffer believes he is facing friendly troops for a simple reason of poor visibility and being nearsighted. So Zollicoffer is nearsighted, and you could imagine both sides are coming, and they think, Zollicoffer and Fry think they are facing friendly fire. They think that they're both on their side. Fry can't see what uniform Zollicoffer is using because he's wearing a white raincoat covering his blue pants, which you could easily think of as Union. A captain on Zollicoffer's staff realizes the mistake and comes from the woods and shoots towards Fry. Fry retaliates and shoots towards the now known enemy and strikes General Zollicoffer, who falls fatally shot on the battlefield. And that red star is where he fell. He is the first general officer killed in the Western theater of the Civil War. The inexperienced men who were directly under the lead of Zollicoffer fail to mount any sort of attack for the rest of the battle. So you can imagine they're having their leader fall, they're inexperienced men, the weather, so all those things together, they're just they don't know what to do, so they just fall back. Okay. The 15th Mississippi and the 20th Tennessee continue to fight on the Confederate right flank toward the 4th Kentucky. The only thing on the muddy road that separates the two is a split rail fence. Confederates get to the fence and draw out their bayonets. All this fighting can be seen in the middle of the map. As the fighting is happening, Union General Thomas arrives with fresh troops, which are much needed. The first to arrive was from Company C of the 1st Ohio Light Artillery, which is represented by that blue starburst you just saw on the screen. Other troops that arrived to the front line include the 2nd Minnesota, and the 9th Ohio. The 2nd Minnesota, which would replace the 4th Kentucky, while the 9th Ohio replaces the 10th Indiana that we talked about earlier in the day. At this moment during the battle, it is 4-3, with the Union forces having a slight advantage of more men. After about an hour, finally the 15th Mississippi and the 20th Tennessee, reinforced by the 20th Tennessee and the 25th Tennessee, So here's the 9th Ohio, 2nd Minnesota, 20th Tennessee, and the 25th. General Thomas has noticed that the Confederates were wavering and decided to throw everything he had at them. Attacking from both sides, the Union troops were finally able to send the Confederates back to Beech Grove, where they had originally been camped during their winter camp. And the Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky was over. So although it's a one-day battle, a lot of things happened during that battle, and I hope I was clear enough for you. The Confederates used steamboats to retreat, going over the river back into Tennessee. The Union, they had 246 casualties, and 39 were killed in action. On the Confederate side, they had 533 casualties, more than 100 killed in action. Felix Zollicoffer, his body was recovered from the battle, and he returned to Tennessee and is buried in Nashville, Tennessee. The Confederates had a mass grave on the battlefield. We're going to talk about that in a moment. The battle cracks the Confederate defensive line in Kentucky and opens the line into Tennessee for Union invasion. And the next battle will be Fort Donelson in Tennessee, which is also part of the National Park Service. General Thomas chose a hill at Mill Springs for the final resting place of his Union soldiers. The Mill Springs National Cemetery was created. In 1868, the 2.5 acres of the cemetery was purchased by the federal government, and so began the preservation of the battlefield. In 1910, the location of a Confederate mass grave that I mentioned was donated, and Confederate veterans dedicated a small monument to Zollicoffer, their fallen leader, as well as a monument to their fellow soldiers. This piece of land was called Zollicoffer Park. The battlefield park was run by the Pulaski County government for nearly 30 years. In 1991, the Civil War Sites Advisory Committee, which is appointed by Congress, designated Mill Springs Battlefield as one of the 25 most endangered battlefields. Later, in 1992, 20 residents from the area formed the Mill Springs Battlefield Association to preserve, protect, interpret, and maintain the Mill Springs battlefield. In 1993, became a National Historic Landmark. The American Battlefield Protection Program came to the site, and there was a gentleman. He wanted to know if there was more land to be preserved. And there had been. There was 15 acres available, and this gentleman purchased it for the purpose of preservation. He basically handed them a check for the land to preserve it. This gentleman, his name was Rod Heller, and he was the first president of the American Battlefield Trust that many of you might know. I used their maps today in this presentation. And that was the beginning of the relationship between the two, Battlefield Trust and Battle of Mill Springs Association. A total of 600 core battlefield acres were purchased along with these specific sites of the battlefield. The first being this Brown Lanier house, which was both Zollicoffer and then George Thomas's headquarters. So it served both sides during the battle. This West Metcalf Hospital, or house, which was a Confederate hospital. 200 acres of Confederate campsites were also preserved. When Confederate General Felix Zollicoffer was shot, he was taken to a nearby oak tree, which he died under. And this was the oak tree that he died under. A man, his name was William Burton. He owned the land on which he died. Zollicoffer died. And in 1892, his daughter Dorothea was born. And this is Dorothea here as an adult. And when she was just 9 years old, she had seen people going to the National Cemetery to decorate the graves. And she, because her father had Zollicoffer's grave and then the mass grave as well, she decided they needed to be remembered. So she started to decorate these graves as she had seen the other people do. She started to decorate these graves with a flower entwined evergreen wreath, as you can see there, and placed it on the mass grave. She continued decorating the Zolly tree on Memorial Day until 1947, when disabled by arthritis. And then her family continues the tradition. And in my research, I found maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, the actual tree that he passed away underneath fell down during a lightning storm, but a sapling has been started to grow from that same tree there. So that's kind of interesting. We have a new sapling. In January of 2012, and in honor of the 115th anniversary of the Battle of Mill Springs, U.S. Congressman Harold Hale Rogers, that you see here, introduced a legislation that directs the National Park Service to conduct a study to evaluate and to see if this park could enter the National Park Service. It took 8 years going through all the paperwork and figuring out if it really was worth saving. And it became the 421st site in the National Park Service in 2020. So September 22nd, 2020, it was designated Mill Springs Battlefield National Monument. If you go to many national parks, you'll come to know that there's many different names. So I always have to make sure I specifically say the correct name here. And the American Battlefield Trust, before that, preserved nearly 900 acres of this battlefield for us today. And there's one more thing that I wanted to share with you before I go with your questions that anybody might have. And this is the next slide. So what I liked about the Civil War is the human stories, the connections that I can make. And my father and I, we do our family history. And so I always think before or after, probably a lot of times after going somewhere, I wonder if I ever have ancestors that fought here. So I looked, and these gentlemen, they all come from the same family, the Custer family. And if that name sounds familiar, they are all related to George Armstrong Custer. And John H., that we see here on the left, was his uncle. And these are, John Marion is his cousin. And then these two other gentlemen, Robert Jackson and Franklin Hall, are cousin-in-law, so they were married to his cousins. But they all fought at the Battle of Mill Springs. They fought with the 16th Alabama, and another cousin-in-law of his, George Washington House, fought for the 5th Tennessee as well during the battle. But he passed away at Chickamauga the next year. Another Garfield connection. So when it is said that the Civil War was truly family against family, brother against brother, this represents that. And if you're interested in learning about a Civil War ancestor that you might have later on this year, I know it's only January, but later on this year, and I believe in October, myself and another ranger, Ranger Powell, we're going to talk about finding more information about your Civil War ancestor.